Well, hello there. Who are you?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Killing must feel good to God, too. He does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
After all, murder is, or should be, an art.
I could kill you now pretty easily. Do some interesting things before anyone showed up.
What are these films you can't wait to look at?
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast and the 16th episode of our series dedicated to on-screen serial killers of horror film and TV history. I'm your podcast host, Anna Bukatskaya, and if you thought I wouldn't find a way to shoehorn in Jennifer Lopez into a horror film history podcast about serial killers, well, you don't know me at all. In this episode, I'm joined by a fabulous first-time guest, author Heather Parry, to discuss possibly the most unlikely and unhinged double bill I've ever presented on this show. Tarsem Singh's horror film The Cell, starring J-Lo as an angelic therapist who infiltrates the dreams of a serial killer in a coma. Yes, that is the actual plot, just go with it. And 2006's Perfume, the story of a murderer, starring a young Ben Whishaw, yes, that is the voice of Paddington Bear, just go with it, as a young man in 17th century France endowed with an almost supernaturally great sense of smell, which logically pushes him to murder a bunch of women. You'll have to listen to the episode to find out what these films have in common, aside from being possibly two of the strangest movies I've covered on this show so far. Let me know what you think of this double bill and of the episode or the series over on socials at The Final Girls UK, or you can always drop me a line on hello@thefinalgirls.co.uk. If you are inclined to support the podcast, you can leave me a review over on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I do read all of them. And if you're feeling particularly generous, you can head over to the Final Girls Patreon, where I cover new horror, film, TV, and book releases. And with all of that said, please enjoy our take on The Cell and Perfume, the story of a murderer. Heather, thank you so much for making the time to watch these two serial killer movies for me.
Oh, it was a pleasure, and I'm really happy to be talking about them with you.
I don't know if happy is the word I would use. But then again, this entire series talking about serial killer movies has given me so much joy that I'm finding myself problematic in how much I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, we're probably all on a list somewhere, right?
Oh, 1000%. My Google history search for the past couple months is highly suspect. But as I do with every single guest that comes onto the podcast for the first time, I wanted to ask you, first of all, what is your own personal relationship with horror?
Yeah, that's a great question. I sometimes get described as a horror writer, which it sits kind of weirdly with me because I don't really think of what I write as horror. I kind of think of it as like dark literary fiction, maybe kind of horror adjacent. But I really was brought up on like horror literature. Like I've said this before, but I was very much the Goosebumps to Point Horror to Stephen King timeline as a teenager. So I was reading a lot of, the very kind of classic Stephen King books when I was kind of mid-teens, which, for some of them is certainly a bit too young. And then I really got into, in terms of movies, I really got into kind of like classic horror. And this is how much of a fucking douchebag I am. My dissertation was on American Psycho, Fight Club. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. The boy movie special.
I think I was trying to position them both as like new American Gothic, because obviously they both play with this idea of the double, and it's kind of like dying systems, capitalism being the one in both of those examples. I don't know if it worked really, and only one of those books stands up to a repeat reading.
Which one is it, out of curiosity?
It's American Psycho.
Interesting. So the episode that's going out at the time of recording, it's not out yet, but the episode that's going out tomorrow on Friday is about American Psycho. And just as an aside, I reread the book kind of to re-familiarize myself with it. I read it ages ago when I was a teenager, and I found it borderline unreadable. Like, I think it's brilliant. Like, I think that is very much part of the design of it, but it is the most infuriating reading experience. And I just packed up my Fight Club somewhere, because I was as a baby teenage emo edgelord, I also was a big Chuck Palahniuk nerd. So I have my Fight Club somewhere, but I haven't tried to reread it in ages. That'd be an interesting exercise.
I had a kind of similar thing where obviously I read it. I read both books as a teenager, and then I read them over and over again for my dissertation. But I hadn't picked up either of them in years. And then I was just in a bookshop last year, and I just saw American Psycho on the shelf. So I picked it up and just flicked to a random page. And I was absolutely so deeply disgusted in a way that I really was not. I mean, it's close to 20 years ago now. And I found that was very interesting, because obviously the book hasn't changed. I have changed. Yeah. And I remember, having a really visceral response at the time. I mean, the rat scene in particular, I almost threw up on a train reading that. But this wasn't even that part. It was just another random kind of, the violence parts. Another one of those. And I was like, oh my God, I don't know if I could read this now. And then I think the infuriating bits I would probably enjoy. I like a writer that will make me sit through pages and pages and pages of digression on Huey Lewis and the News, for instance, because I just think that's really amusing, and I can see the writer pushing you as a reader, and I guess that is what he was doing with the whole book. But yeah, I think it just hits so different, that book, in your life. But I do love the movie. And I also love the movie of Fight Club, and I think the movie actually stands up a lot more than the book.
I'm very keen to reread it now, and I do love both the films for very different reasons, and equally I think they've both been misappropriated and misunderstood by the very audiences that the films are satirizing. Digression so early on, and one question in, and already there's a digression. Love this for both of us. No, I'll take fully the blame for that. But moving on to serial killers, which are my focus in this series. What do you think of when you think of movie serial killers?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and again, I think of Patrick Bateman quite strongly. It made me think of just how much of the content I watch is based around killers. Interesting. Or a killing, or you know what I mean, like maybe one specific killing. Even something like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? That's about a killing. It's about a killer, really. Yeah. And yeah, I think it probably. I was thinking of the way that serial killer movies kind of fall into two categories for me in how they treat the serial killer. And I think this is going to become kind of very pertinent as we speak about The Cell in particular. But there is the kind of, they must be stopped and they must be helped. And I think these two categories are very, very interesting with each other. And I was trying to kind of think of a timeline of when that changed and whether it's moved back again, going from they're just kind of like freaks, who need to, there's just always been something wrong with them in inverted commas, which is like the Halloween, the Michael Myers kind of thing. Yeah. And then we move to this, well, something's happened to them to make them that way. And then I don't know if we've kind of moved back in the other direction, or whether, maybe the 90s was one way and the 2000s were another. I don't know. It's just got me. I think I need to read like 20 books on serial killers now to unpack all my thoughts.
Well, it's so interesting because I love this, like that There Must Be Stopped, which is also very related to the other key figure that appears in a lot of these movies, and I've mentioned this before, the detective, right? The detective that is trying to chase down the serial killer. And it was really hard narrowing down the films to cover in this series because a lot of them are crime films, procedurals, right? Where most of the time we're spending with the detective. Seven is a great example, which I was
just thinking of Seven.
Yeah, which is kind of an exception to the sort of films that I'm covering, which are mostly focused on a killer as opposed to the detective. And Seven is all about the detectives pursuing the killer, trying to stop him, and that they must be helped. I think a lot of the times is manifesting itself as they must be understood. You know, if we can't help them, we can kill them, but we also must understand them. And there's this really bizarre film from 1968 about the Boston Strangler that I've covered in the series, which is so very much that vibe. There's this whole bizarre third act where Henry Fonda and Tony Curtis, one of them is a killer, the other is like this sort of profiler person, are sitting in just a blank white room, and he's trying to analyze the Boston Strangler. He's trying to get inside, he's trying to sell him basically. And it's so much more concerned, it's half and half. It's half concerned with stopping the killer and half concerned with understanding him instead of helping him.
Interesting. I wonder, you know, I started to kind of hatch a semi-theory about this and about whether, you know, the body keeps the score.
Yes.
The like cult book. I was like, oh, I wonder when that came out the first time, and I wonder if it influenced the writing of serial killers afterwards, you know, and into this way of like, well, we're all just people, and we're, you know, trauma manifests in different ways, and it, you know, hurt people, which is a phrase I hate, but it actually does not work at all. For the time, like, no, it absolutely does not. But I would be really interested to see where like the kind of changing psychology or, you know, psychotherapy trends, how they've mapped against serial killer movies over the years and over the decades.
Oh, I love that. Any psychotherapists that are listening to this, please get in touch. I wanna ask you some questions. But that kind of leads us on nicely into the first of the two films that we're covering, The Cell from the year 2000 by director Tarsem Singh. Now, this is I sort of wondered why you were the first person who wanted to talk about this film. And I thought it had such a cult following. I was like, oh my God, people are going to be clamoring for, you know, to discuss The Cell. And I don't know why it's doesn't have more of a footprint, and I wonder that as well about Tarsem's works in general. So kind of where do you stand on his body of work and on this film in particular? Like, do you have a particular relationship with The Cell?
Well, to be honest, this is the only film of his that I've seen, and the reason it really jumped out to me from the list you sent was that I think I saw it on like Channel 4. You know how Channel 4 used to have like the really dark movies quite late at night? I think I just came upon it. So, I mean, when would that probably have been? Like 2002, 2003. So I would have been like 15, 16, I think. No, that's not right. Anyway, I would be kind of like mid-teens. And the image of the horse in the kind of tanks, the cut-up image of the horse, that has stayed with me so strongly. But almost nothing else about the film did, apart from, you know, it was Jennifer Lopez and it was these crazy dreamscapes. And I think its relationship to art and how it uses art was very kind of like, it hooked me a lot. But I couldn't remember whether I thought the movie was bad or good.
So what is your verdict after rewatching it for this?
I think my main question is like, what the fuck is Vince Vaughn doing in this movie? It makes no sense.
He's so out of place in it.
I mean, J-Lo also is, you know, like it was like they were just trying to take these two particular people and slightly change their career in a way that I don't really believe worked. They have no chemistry whatsoever. But then, yeah, I mean, it kind of is interesting, you know. So my partner is a therapist, a counselor, quite like a, you know, a recently kind of trained one. So I have been thinking a lot about the inner life and trauma and all these kind of things, and I thought, you know, it's not an uninteresting exploration of that, and it's very bold in its visual style. You know, from kind of shot one, it's like, I'm doing a thing, and this is not going to be a regular kind of serial killer movie. This is not going to be a regular horror film. You're going to come with me while I kind of confuse you and make a lot of some very clear and somewhat opaque references to art and kind of theories and stuff. And the main story, I mean, it's kind of gratuitous in some ways, but very, very interesting in others.
Because the main thrust of the story, the main premise for anyone who is somehow listening to this despite never having seen The Cell, or might vaguely remember it from a DVD cover, which is, I think, also how I discovered it. I used to buy a lot of bargain basement DVDs, so I discovered a lot of some of my favorite long-standing horror movies that way, and this was one of them. How do I even phrase the plot of this movie? There is this technology that J-Lo, Jennifer Lopez, is somehow involved in developing, or is the only person capable of using, wherein they put her inside the mind, the dreamscape of children who are in a coma, in order to sort of push them to get out of the coma from inside their mind. And then they take this technology and they apply it to try to capture a serial killer who has the same kind of, has been put in the same kind of comatose state by a rare form of schizophrenia that affects these children and also him, and is somehow triggered by being immersed in water. So he gets, goes into a coma when he takes a bath after doing a hard day's work of murdering women. And then, so she gets sent into the mind of the serial killer, and it becomes this race of, as you were saying, they must be stopped, he must be stopped, they must rescue the one victim that might still be alive. But also because she is Jennifer Lopez and she's pure empathy, she must understand him in order to offer him some solace from within his own twisted, disturbed, serial killing mind.
I think the fact that you struggled so much to kind of outline even the premise of the film speaks to how shonky it really is.
We're not here for the plot, okay? We're not here for the plot. We're here for the costumes and the images and Tarsem's distinct visual style. And I have to say, like, this was the first movie of his that I watched. It was his first film that he made, and I loved The Fall, which is the second movie he made, which was sort of this big, grand, ambitious childhood tale fantasy. And it kind of really flopped, and it's got a real cult following to it. And I feel like The Cell, rewatching it yesterday, I got this distinct feeling that he sold people on a serial killer movie in the wake of like Seven and all of those mid-budget 90s serial killer crime thrillers. Yeah. And then with starring J-Lo and Vince Vaughn. And then he gave them this.
Yeah. Which is kind of like it may actually, the kind of visual style, and especially of the kind of dream world, or maybe the coma world is a better way to put it. It reminded me at times of like Guillermo del Toro's work and his monsters and the visualization of his monsters. But there is also kind of a weird crossover into the real world. Predominantly with like the suits that they have to wear, which is never explained really, to go into this kind of mental world. And I started to look at because they're like muscles, aren't they? Like,
yes,
it's like almost like someone's been flayed, which is
Mhm.
very interesting in terms of the vulnerability of this kind of work, of therapy, of going into the world of someone who is so troubled or so violent. But I was like, they really look like the costumes from Dracula. And I looked it up.
It's the same
And they
costume
are.
designer.
I think they're in fact the same outfits. So it's is it Eiko Ishioka? Her
It's
name?
Eiko Ishioka, yeah. She did all
Yeah.
the costumes for the dream world, the coma world. And April Napier was working as a costume designer in the film as well, but she was in charge of all the sort of the real world costumes. So all the dreary suits and all that
Yeah.
stuff. She did that, and then Ishioka did all the unbelievably amazing costumes for the dream world. Like, they're so intricate and weird.
And so referential to so many different things as well, like other movies and artworks and things like this. So yeah, I think there's actually kind of a lot of implicit stuff in the costuming that maybe isn't there in the script or indeed the acting.
I'll pick that back up again, but I do want to talk about the costuming, because I think, like, what did you read into the costume? What did that give you from the movie that maybe other elements of it didn't?
I think it's exploring a much more kind of nuanced point, which I think that film broadly is doing quite, like, as a blunt, with a blunt object kind of thing, which is something bad has happened to this guy and this is why he's awful. Whereas I think the costuming pulls that out into, we all kind of have these demons and horrors and monsters and things that we are troubled by. And I think it just wove that into the scenes a lot more than the kind of script or the acting. Although I did read that in one of the original kind of versions of the script, it had a really different kind of explanation as to why J-Lo is in this line of work. Okay. Which I'm glad they didn't put in, because it would have really pissed me off.
What was it?
It was that she had an abortion in college.
No.
Which for me is on the same kind of like misogyny level as in Prometheus, where she says, I can't create life for the reason that she's a scientist, which I that pissed me off more than anything else in any other film. Like, I can feel myself getting angry about it now. This idea that like a brilliant woman can only be doing anything related to childbearing or not childbearing. Like, they are the two options you have. You have a mother, you are a mother, or you can't be a mother, or you did something so you're not a mother and you are ruined by it for your whole life. I hate that. And I think that would have been straying very strongly into these waters. But had they kept that in the script, it would at least have kind of explained a lot of her reaction to being in his world and the things she sees there as well, I think.
Well, there's several interesting threads there. So kind of to stick to the costumes for a second, one of the things I kind of really agree with you, that the costumes are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. They're one of the, next to the way that Tarsem creates images, I think his collaboration with Ishioka is perfect, because her costumes just seem otherworldly. They are also kind of built around the physicality of the actor so well. J-Lo gets a bit of that. I think one of the best costumes is when she's sort of in the torture chamber, in the dream torture chamber of Steger, and she had J-Lo apparently did not like, I was reading some old interviews, J-Lo apparently did not like the neck brace that she has on, which was sculpted based on her neck and her collarbone.
Oh, right.
And the costume designer was like, yeah, it's not supposed to be comfortable, you're being tortured, that's the point. Love that. But then especially Vincent D'Onofrio, because he's such a huge guy. Like, he's already a big guy, he's at like 6'3", he's really broad, he has this really intense physicality, and the way that he uses his body in the film, I think, coordinates with the costuming so well, because we're it also brings in this idea of the way that this character, the serial killer, sees himself. Now he sees himself in these different contradictory ways. You know, he's this grand torture master in all of these like golden clothing and like these really ornate costuming, and then he's like the serpent king who's just, and he's doing all this weird slithery stuff with his body while he's wearing horns and like fake green scale makeup on his chest. And then when he's sort of just himself with this terrible bowl haircut and the suspension rings on his back, he's always really hunched over, he's sitting down, he's so much smaller than he actually is in other scenes. I think like there's not much in the script as to who this character is, why he does the thing he does. Like, oh yeah, had a abusive dad. That's it. That's all we get, really. We don't get anything else. But this elaborate internal idea of himself and how he sort of interprets the violence that he commits, the kills that he does, is, I think, goes so hand in hand with the costume in a way that only a handful of other horror films have woven in together so well. Like Hellraiser is the one that comes to mind, where the horror and the goriness of that film is so intertwined with the way that the Cenobites look and dress, the design of them, the way that all the, you know, the gear and the leather is displayed on their bodies, and even how their bodies are flayed.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And now I really am actually vibing with what you said about him in his real world being like kind of physically self-contained, right? Always bringing himself in, hunched shoulders. And then all of his costumes, they really take up space, or they expand or extend on his body. So, you know, the kind of like flowing black kind of silk parts, or the like long kind of like, I think it is still a cape, you know, the kind of long black cape that flows behind him as well, or even things that just open his chest up. That's all very kind of strong, isn't it? That's a very kind of like puffed up animal kind of come at me kind of look, as opposed to the inwards folding of the way he is in the real world. Yeah, that's a really good point you made there, Anna.
And you know, you mentioned it before, but let's get into the whole J-Lo thing.
Yeah. I don't know what was happening with her agent around this time. Well, I feel like she said, I want to be in films, and then they really tried, you know.
Oh, well, I have some insight to offer in this, because unfortunately I'm obsessed with the J-Lo discourse. I have watched so for listeners who might not be in the internet rabbit hole, for months now since she released her, I can't believe I'm talking about this again, her film that's not a film, music video / visual album thing on Amazon Prime called This Is Me Now, with a companion documentary, both of which I have now watched twice, by the way. So I know so much about J-Lo at this point. She's always had the same agent from the start. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And she was, her like real breakout was actually acting in Selena. So in 97. And then she did this incredible crime thriller with Steven Soderbergh called Out of Sight. So she was good.
Yeah.
She was good. And then like all the music and stuff was happening. The year 2000 is when she wore the very famous Versace green silk dress. You know the one?
Yeah, I would have totally said that was earlier, like mid-90s, but I'm terrible with history.
And this is the year in which she releases The Cell, and it's probably the oddest J-Lo film choice I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Because what did you think of her? Similarly to Vince Vaughn, she kind of seems out of place in this vision, doesn't she?
She does. I mean, maybe it's, you know, of all the things that we know about her or we have read about her, I guess they're alleged on the internet. Maybe appearing to be a super empathetic person is not actually that easy for Jennifer Lopez. But then, maybe the script actually doesn't help her. She, as a character, maybe she doesn't really get that much to go on. If you think about her, she's kind of exists within this place of just catering to other people, really. She feels very kind of like caregiver coded in a way that she doesn't really have much outside of that. Or maybe that's just kind of how I took her.
No, totally. I think this is one of the things that annoyed me the most, that I definitely misremembered about the film. She's going for this like very saintly, beatific, like almost aggressively empathetic vibe, She's like wants to just coddle the baby serial killer. She's crying. She's like, "Oh no, sweetie, it was not your fault. Nobody should be treated that way." It's like, "Oh, he did like torture and murder all these women." It's like,
yeah.
"Oh, but he had a bad dad, I get it. I get it. It's terrible." And even the costuming, just like she's always dressed in sort of these Virgin Mary nun-esque, like white flowing gowns.
Yeah, like angel nurse is how I would describe how she is in the dream world. Or like a couple of times there's like a constraining thing on her face that made me kind of think of how they costumed Jessica in the second June movie. Almost like a Holy Mother, but often with something in front of her face or her mouth, or like a weird kind of metal bit of headgear somewhere, or like you said, the thing around her neck, which is interesting in a way that I think maybe wasn't drawn out successfully. But yeah, beatific was the way. It's a perfect description for how she plays it, and that's just not very fascinating as a way to play a character, is it? You want to. No one's saintly is actually that interesting. No. You want something else going on.
I know, and I think that's kind of one of the biggest failures, right? Is that I think it's a failure in the script maybe, or the fundamental idea, because the whole premise is, let's get inside the mind of a serial killer. And I think that part is really successful because it's not trying to be too literal. It's not trying to explain away anything. It's trying to almost visualize something that we find morally very hard to understand. But then in the middle here, there's this character who is supposed to be all goodness, but we know nothing about her. So her internal world is kind of non-existent.
Yeah.
Which is weird, because the whole premise is that you're getting this like wholly pure and perfect angel woman and this really terrible, terrible human. So kind of having the light and the dark of both their inner worlds, but she doesn't really get one.
Yeah, or her inner world is inextricably linked to the little boy's world or the killer's world, and then or her like real life is then inextricably linked with Vince Vaughn. There should be like there should be a name for this, like the Bechdel test, but not about two women speaking, about whether a woman has anything that's not related to a man in a film. Does she have an outside life that is actually just about her being a woman? And this film, I think, would fail that test.
I would actually say that this film would fail that for every other character, because it would also fail that for Vince Vaughn's character. It's like, who is this guy outside of chasing after this particular killer?
I am just so fascinated by his casting, and honestly, like he's got a face that's telling a joke. His face is a joke face, right?
Do you know the funniest thing is that I was watching the featurettes of the making of videos that are available online of this film, and these little cast interviews, talking heads that they do while they're shooting the film, and it's all kind of fluff. Everyone's amazing, everyone's a visionary, etc., etc. And they cut to Vince Vaughn, and he's fully in his swingers mode. And he just goes, yeah, it's been great. And what's the great thing is that J-Lo comes with this posse, and I've had the chance to hang out with them and, quote, shoot the slang with them. I don't know what that means. I don't think he knows what that means, but he said it with his entire conviction, with his entire chest. He's like, yeah, I'm shooting the slang.
Shoot the slang. I can't even pass that. Like, what does that mean? It kind of feels like, you know how Robin Williams did the really dark movie. I can't think of the name of it.
1
now.
Hour Photo?
Yes. When did that come out?
I'm gonna say maybe 2002, early 2000s for sure.
1 Hour Photo. I want to look it up very quickly. Yeah, 2002. It felt like, you know, he did that so well. And I think actually the seeding of that, this is going to sound like such a weird point. The seeding of that change into this kind of like very dramatic dark actor, I think is actually in Mrs. Doubtfire.
I welcome this digression. Tell me more.
I watched Mrs. Doubtfire with my nephews who were visiting over New Year. And I haven't watched it in many years, and I actually had a blast. Like, it's of that kind of genre of movie where it was kind of mid-list, you know, mid-budget, star vehicle, really brilliantly written from a kind of get in and do what it's doing kind of way. Really funny, really well acted. Obviously very of its time and problematic in the very obvious ways. But there's actually a real darkness to the way he plays that character when he's not doing the really comedy stuff, you know, when he's just a man having an argument with Sally Field, or he's a man who is really at risk of losing his children, who are really the only kind of positive thing in his life. And I feel like that's, people watched that and they were like, oh, maybe Robin Williams could do something that's really dark. But before they did that, they tried it with Vince Vaughn, who does not have the chops.
No, although Vince Vaughn later on would go really dark in True Detective season 2, I believe it is. And then also in Dragged Across Concrete and Cell Block 99. 2 of the most brutal movies I've ever seen.
Maybe it's an age thing then. Maybe he was just too young to be doing it at this time, because he would have only been, what, like late 20s, maybe 30 when they were shooting this film.
Yeah.
And you need to have seen some shit.
Yes. Because his evolution really is swingers, kind of background douchebag, leading man douchebag, then very, very violent douchebag. That's kind of the evolution of Vince Vaughn in cinema.
I feel like I'm going to adopt background douchebag as like, I might get on a t-shirt.
Listen, dress for the job you want, you know? But before we move on to the Perfume, kind of, I think I get the sense that this film really lives and dies on the dream scenes. So do you think its whole shtick, its whole premise of visualizing the internal fucked up dream life of a serial killer works?
That's a good question. I think the way it visualizes the internal world generally, it's probably one of its strengths. And what I found really interesting, so you know the thing that I said I'd remembered most about this film, which is the horse. Yes, it's a horse in the film. Yeah, because the real artwork that's referencing is a cow. So that's a visual reference to a Damien Hirst artwork, which I think, if I'm remembering correctly, is called Some Comfort Gained from the Acceptance of the Inherent Lies in Everything.
Sure.
In that way that the way that Damien Hirst does a really cheap, gratuitous thing and then gives it a great name that implies a deeper meaning that isn't there. I feel like what Damien Hirst was doing in this kind of period of his career as an artist was taking the piss out of the art world. And the visual like landscape of the mind, referencing things like this, speaks to me to actually like something deeper about society and this kind of like cheap, gratuitous capitalist world we live in, where, you know, things are just hacked up and murdered and things are gross, and this is kind of like the world we live in. And if you think of that as a portion of his mind, that actually works really well. That's actually quite good. It's actually like a really interesting thing about how is the society that we live in, and how is the art that we look at, and you know, the kind of, it's like a really late 90s like end of history kind of moment, you know what I mean? Like it's speaking to that kind of, what are we doing here? What are we, you know, it's like a, what am I trying to say? It's like a self kind of repeating, or like meta, or like piss taking, ironic society that we have. And what does that do to our ability to kind of relate to people, or be vulnerable, or
even
heal?
Be scared?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Because we're not really scared of that stuff, we're just looking at it, right? It's like the period of time where the internet was just becoming a thing, and you could just see the worst shit you'd ever seen very easily out there, or you could just start to see like pornography really, you know, cheaply and easily. I think that's maybe like the most interesting thing about the film for me, what that is saying by doing that, and by referencing these things, and by including that in this kind of mind of a really fucked up person, because it kind of says, isn't this doing it to all of us, maybe?
There's something so interesting in that, and it really made me think about kind of the re-experiencing the film and being able to recognize some, not all, of Tarsem's references, including the Damien Hirst one, because there's referencing just in a kind of pointing way, but I think one of the things that stands out to me about what you're saying is also this idea of, and this goes back to the internet again, is this idea of like collecting and hoarding references, and whether that insulates you from ever having to feel anything or connect to anything for real. You're just accumulating knowledges and references and memes and reactions and whatnot. But then with this film, there's it's a really bizarre interpretation of something that comes up a lot in these kind of movies, which is the collecting of the killing. And that can be whatever this, and I'm kind of bringing back to serial killer movies because I think, you know, a lot of the Venn diagram of serial killer movies versus serial killer content that's out there, they all go hand in hand, but only fiction gives itself the allowance to expand that and reinterpret that and maybe visualize, at least in film, on screen in film and TV, into something that doesn't actually replicate the terrible shit that we can access online at any point, and that characters or real life people like Carl Steger can then collect and repurpose for other devious reasons. So the way that we see a dead body of a woman that he has murdered, but we don't actually see her being murdered in the film, which I found really interesting. And then there's another woman that he is imprisoned and is at risk of dying, but she's saved at the end. So we actually never see him kill anyone in the film, which I found to be a really curious thing in a film about a serial killer. But what we do see when J-Lo goes into his head is essentially this like grotesque museum of all of his victims. But they're no longer people, they're no longer the women that he's killed. They're transformed into these images that are all themselves references to art and music videos and things that Tarsem is interested in visually, and things that kind of tie into this late 90s, early 2000s kind of steampunk S&M music video aesthetic thing that was all merging together. And it's also the very start of the internet, so everything is like these little digital cupboards that exist in this dreamscape, but they're very separate from serial killer violence or even the violence of the lead character. And I found that to be quite interesting, that he is sort of perhaps earnestly, and perhaps this is coming from a place of, oh no, now we've got over 20 years of internet shit behind us, and the way that it has rotted and transformed our brains and our understanding of media and movies. We're now looking at this film and seeing all the references, but from a character point of view, he has made his victims into art. He's collecting them in that way. And that is the most fucked up thing for me about The Cell.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Because he's not really getting off on doing the murders. He's getting off on seeing evidence that he must have done these murders, right? So he's getting off on hanging over the dead body, on watching these videos of the person dying. The video thing is really interesting, right? The displacement of a camera between you and what's happened. And then when you think about well, this is what I take the first and last shots to be anyway. I think they're references to the persistence of memory, the Dali melting clocks landscapes. So when you take that reference into it, that kind of framing reference, yeah, it becomes much more about like, yeah, the memory of something or something as a work, or something as a thing that has been done that then you access as a work or as a memory or as an artwork. Yeah. Oh man. That's going to really sit with me.
I'm glad. It's really sitting with me in a way that I almost kind of didn't expect it when I was going in to rewatch the film. And kind of, circling, kind of wrapping together what we had been discussing. I don't think it's the greatest film. It's definitely a really ballsy one that is, I think, communicating in images more than it is in script or in performances, which is what we tend to be used to with these kind of movies.
Yeah, and I'm now troubled by the idea that we're going to go away from this and say, The Cell was a pretty good film.
And that is, think about it, the real horror film of this. The real horror twist of this entire episode is that The Cell, pretty good.
So, if you don't look at the acting or the script or the plot and just take the vibes,
the costume, the slightly off-kilter ideas about the internet. But
amazing.
In an interesting swerve, we're gonna move on to talking about I always forget whether it's Perfume or The Perfume. Perfume.
It's Perfume. Yeah.
Perfume, which a radically opposite vibe in this film.
Well, yeah, the vibe is very different, but like the kind of the thing about the fetishization of women's dead bodies for me was the strong link between the two.
Totally. I definitely want to come back to that, but same kind of question. What is your relationship with Perfume? Because this was a hugely successful historical fantasy novel from 1985. I remember it being everywhere when I was growing up. And then this movie, and it was largely kind of considered unadaptable. And then this movie came about, and at least when I was growing up, it was considered a huge release because it was a really big European co-production between several countries with big recognizable international actors as well as new faces. So what is kind of in your mind or in your memory, the reputation of Perfume?
Well, I don't think it was on my radar at all until I read the book. So I don't engage with media or culture until it's at least 20 years old.
Respectable choice.
For reasons that I think are just related to the fact that I'm a Scorpio. We only watched The Sopranos in lockdown, and then I became obsessed with it 2 decades too late for everyone else. So yeah, this I can't remember anyone ever speaking about this film. Really? I couldn't. I don't know if I could have told you there was a film before I read the book and then just looked into it. But the book is one that people have told me personally to read for a long time. They were like, "Oh, you'll love it. You'll love it. It's so your vibe. It's dark. It's like murdery. It's about bodily functions." I get it. Totally get it. I didn't love the book as much as I wanted to, because it's quite turgid. And I actually really love, so the writer is Patrick Suskind. I love another book of his called The Pigeon, which is just about a man who's kind of like existentially terrified about a pigeon outside his flat. It's so great. It's really good. So Perfume was really different. Like that prose is quite sparse in The Pigeon and all this kind of stuff. Whereas it's very turgid, the writing in Perfume. It's, it evokes everything that the film evokes in that way. And it got better. And the best thing about it was the end, which I think is true of the film also, perhaps a controversial opinion.
No, I actually share that opinion. I agree. I think the end of Perfume is the best thing about it. And it's so interesting. Maybe this film was just big in Spain, because I remember it being everywhere. And I read the book at that time. I actually just found my Spanish translated copy of it when I was boxing up my books. But both the novel and the film, especially in the visual medium, they're anchored on this really difficult thing to describe in both words, and especially difficult to visualize, which is smell. How do you think the film especially tries to capture what it's like for this supernaturally smell-endowed dude to exist?
Well, it's kind of it's a thankless task, isn't it, for an actor to be like, so we're going to do a lot of sniffing.
A lot of close-ups of your nostrils, Ben.
Yeah. We're going to really evoke a lot of stink, which they kind of do in the scene setting, right? The stuff about like the fish market. It's evoking something that so you don't have to see people smelling it because it will smell. And what we know about Paris during that time is it was like famously disgustingly stinky. And actually, I think the book does it really well, because it's just easier to describe something on the page than it is to have an act, show an actor having to respond to it or something. That's quite difficult. But I think this is one of the, I don't know, Anna, I've been thinking loads about adaptation lately. and the problems of people not appreciating the difference between mediums. And I get why people said this was unfilmable, and I think it really could have done with being more changed from the book. It's actually it's just a direct adaptation, like almost perfectly. Yeah, there's so little left out of it that I think needed to be left out of it. And I don't think it really landed well on how are we going to visualize smell. Do you?
That's really interesting, because I don't have a super close memory of the book, so I can't really talk about the adaptation, but I was really struck by how it attempted to do the smell thing, mostly by being very literal about it, and through a lot of rapid fire cross-cutting, a lot of rapid fire montages of like things that instantly evoke a smell. So like fish guts, or like gross things, a lot of putrid stuff. So it was but it really struggled to evoke lovely smells. So the whole premise of Perfume is that this man who's born into abject poverty in like, is it 16th or 17th century France?
I think it's 17th.
17th, yes. And he's sort of just guided by his nose the entire time. That's how he survives. That's how he gets by. And he discovers that this magnificent, undescribable smell, which is basically a virgin. It's a virgin woman. And he then like, I must possess the smell. So he kills her, and it's like, oh, but it's gone because she's dead. What happened? It's like, oh, I must learn how to conserve the smell. So he learns how to make perfumes, and then sets himself the task of kind of creating this perfect perfume that's made up of 13 virgin smells. But the way the film is very good at portraying anything that we can relate to a smell, like when it shows us roses, we know what a rose smells like, but we don't know what this mythical virginal scent is. So all it does is just show us body parts of women, like a little close up of some boob, a little close up of some neck. They're all perfectly pale. They've all got like perfectly wavy French hair. They're all really slim. So it's just like, oh, so you're just showing us these little details of a woman's body, but that doesn't evoke a smell. It's just that's where it suffers for me. It's very good with the bad smells, but it doesn't know how to sell us on the thing that is going to drive the lead character.
And also the bodies of the women are all really clean. Weirdly, given everything else in the film, and especially at the start. And yeah, so it's almost like they're just the removal of these awful smells. But that's actually, like, if you think about why you're attracted to people, their smell kind of is a huge part of it, right?
Totally.
My cat, I have 2 cats. My cat every morning gets into my partner's armpit and smushes her face right in. So she gets she'll just love to like absolutely cover her whole face in that like armpit stink. I think that's what we do as people too, right?
Totally.
The smell of your lover is very physical. It's very pheromonal. It's not like an absence of sweat. It's actually the smell of their sweat and the smell of them being in bed and the smell of their stress and these kind of things. But you can't really describe or evoke that, I think. And yeah, they seem to want to do it as an absence, which is, it just doesn't really work.
Yeah, so it requires a lot of you as in the viewer trying to imagine what that must smell like. And I think we then tend to project the best smell that we can recall, because it's all in the musical notes, it's in Ben Wishaw's performance, it's in the lighting. Even he lights these women with this sort of like very golden in this golden kind of way to make them appear almost not saint-like, but almost like they're covered in honey.
Yeah, and I almost think it's missing a trick to try and get you to think of all these smells, because the more interesting stuff visually is what he does to them, that the image of them smothered in the kind of cold fat when he's trying to do is it enfleurage, the name of the technique. That is really visually interesting, and that actually makes you feel things quite a lot that just kind of seeing him sniff a woman's back is perhaps not going to really achieve. So yeah, I think that is a problem with just being too close to the book and not getting to the stuff that's actually really visually interesting to be put on screen, and just trying to do something you just can't do. I feel like I would have been a lot happier had they just given up that kind of, I need you to smell what a woman smells like, I need you to imagine what he's smelling, and it should have focused more on what he did. And also the book is it reads much more like a fairy tale, so you forgive all the weird bits that kind of don't make a lot of sense, you know what I mean? Because it's a fairy tale, you're reading it, it's that way, some things are just a given. But the grim dark realism of the kind of setting of the film, especially at the beginning, kind of works against that. And yeah, I just wish they had been a bit bolder in how they brought it to screen.
It's such a strange film. Like, I remember going to see this in the cinema and liking it, have it on Blu-ray, and when I sat down to rewatch it, I was really taken aback how odd it is. And part of that has to do with this weird in-between of the fairy tale vibe, the social realist thing, this kind of period social realist thing, and a more traditional serial killer narrative. But I think mostly it's in how it frames the lead character, who's the killer, Jean-Baptiste Grenouille. So what do you make of the way that he's framed in the film, and also how Ben Whishaw plays him?
So I've got this issue currently with Hollywood casting twinks to play thick man roles.
I'm listening.
Being like Timothy in June 2. He doesn't look like a Lisan Al-Gaib. He doesn't. Javier Bardem looks like a Lisan Al-Gaib, This twink is not going to lead a revolution. He's too thin. He's too young. He looks 12 years old. I think how I had imagined Grenouille from the book was a much more kind of stout, broad, kind of stereotypically masculine guy. And, you know, therefore having all this strength in his hands to do the thing he does. And then, you know, being kind of brutish in his physicality. And I don't know, Ben Whishaw just didn't really sit in that role very well for me. I think he did a fine job acting, and as we said, you know, a difficult role, really. But he was, yeah, it was kind of this weird kind of like Oliver thing of him, you know, being kind of like from the grimdark European city streets of old, and then, you know, his language is very odd at the beginning, and the fact that he doesn't speak for maybe the first 30 minutes of the film.
He barely speaks in the film.
Yeah, and it's very kind of like Oliver vibes, and then we go into something completely different. So again, yeah, I felt like it was working against it. And you know, I think they could have just stopped trying to be so realistic in the kind of period drama element of it and given Ben Whishaw a bit more, I don't know, space to be really weird. I also think what didn't help was the accents for me. Because how are you doing this like really strong period drama and then you've got Alan Rickman doing Alan Rickman's voice and Ben Whishaw doing Ben Wishaw's voice, and then is it Dustin Hoffman?
It is.
Doing Dustin Hoffman's voice when they're supposed to be in like 17th century Paris. Maybe that's me just getting hung up on stuff, but it was like, am I supposed to believe this is real or not? I don't know anymore.
Well, I sort of disagree on Ben Whishaw, but I did find the accents really funny because it just screamed for me of, oh, it doesn't really matter. This is meant for everyone, and you know, it's the fairy tale aspect of it. That's kind of how I read it. It's like, oh, this is not meant to be realistic, so everybody just speak wherever you want to speak, except Whishaw, who I think kind of, not accent wise, but he speaks in this very strained, clipped way, which is what I imagine someone like Grenouille, a character who doesn't speak very much, isn't spoken to very much at all, and doesn't really communicate through words. That's how I imagine he would sound. He kind of like croaks words out. But then on your point of like casting twins in thick men roles, I actually really don't agree, because for me...
Oh, really?
Yeah, for me, I love the fact that he's more sinewy and slim and kind of physically unthreatening, because that's what makes him creepier for me. Because the way that he just appears out of the shadows, and the women that he attacks are not scared of him. They're just not.
That's true.
They look at him, they look him straight in the eye, and they don't see him as a threat. And then when he attacks, they're completely unprepared to defend themselves. They don't even know what to do. And I find kind of that eerie presence quite effective. And the fact that there's so many shots where he sort of disappears into the shadows, into the dark, or reappears out of the shadows, I think works really well with Ben Wishaw's like particular face and his physique. He's got really, really dark hair, so it's kind of like you just see the tip of his nose appear out of the shadows, and then all of him. That worked for me. And it's also like this effort, like he's just like this cockroach that will not die, no matter how much strain he's put under, no matter how emaciated and overworked and how everybody around him is dropping dead all the time. He will continue living until he gets to this perfume making mission that he sets out for himself. But what I found really interesting, and you mentioned it a little bit before, is how the film actually portrays the killings. So whether it's in the cell, we never actually see him kill. Here we see him kill 13 times, actually 14. What do you make of the way that Perfume actually shows the crimes?
Yeah, see, I was just going to ask this of you as well, off your Ben Whishaw rehabilitation, in my mind.
Hey, I love Ben Whishaw. I've always loved him as an actor.
I don't have a thing about him. I don't have a thing against him at all. But, like, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because the way the film portrays him is kind of like someone who's accidentally become a killer, but then really runs with it, which is quite an odd. It's quite an odd characterization. Like he's very much naive, isn't he? I suppose would be the perfect way to put him. Like when he's in his younger years, when he's doing his first kind of accidental killing, you're like, I suppose it's interesting whether you could call that accidental or not, because he's there for a reason, you know, approaching this woman and stuff. But you know, it's kind of like, well, he didn't have enough socialization to know what's right or wrong, and he was born out of this kind of very inhuman society, and even the way his mother birthed him was very strange and brutal, and then literally kind of threw him away. You know, the film seems to be saying, well, what else could this person kind of have been? You know, how could he have really ended up as anything else? But then it does show him as quite like naive and weirdly hardworking, which isn't what you usually get.
Super hardworking, very diligent, very focused.
Yeah, like very, also quite smart. You know, he learns quickly, but also very impassioned and stuff. You know, you could almost say like neurodivergent coded in various different ways, which is possibly problematic in its own thing. But yeah, and then he just becomes this kind of cold-blooded killer, but then also just kind of not cold-blooded, very calculated as well. So I find it a kind of weird characterization of a killer that I don't think it can quite settle on how we're supposed to feel about him. What do you think?
Totally. And I think maybe that's why I find it such a strange viewing experience, because like you could say, to echo what you were saying before, that he's someone who discovers a hobby and then makes it their entire personality. And you could do that about knitting, or I don't know, running, and then it's like you're completely decked out, or you only listen to running podcasts and you only talk about running, and you measure everything that you put in your body or that comes out of your body in terms of how it affects your running. That's how I imagine Grinny. He could have just gotten into running instead of serial murder. But there's this kind of thing about especially how he kills women, and how it's very classic serial killer in many ways, right? He has got his vision, the 13 ingredients of this mega perfume, and the women he kills are not really people, they're just the ingredients that he needs to complete his vision, his fantasy, right? But then everything he does is sort of coded as sexual violence, but it's not at all presented as sexual. He only sees women as body parts, as ingredients. The film very much frames them in that way. There's like all these close-ups on their skin, on their breasts, very rarely their faces, very rarely the full body. It's always just like cut off at the head, basically. And there's so many hints at it being sexually motivated, but he's so uninterested in that, so laser focused on just getting the perfume. And then when he discards those bodies, and there's this montage of them just finding these random bodies stacked somewhere, like in little corners where he just dumped them. In all of them are so clean, like you were saying before, and then he cleans them out even more because he cuts their hair, he covers them in this cold animal fat, he then scrubs that all off. So they're like these dummy bodies that are all super pale. We never actually we see him killed, but accidentally. But everything about him is about not playing in a sexual sense, but just maneuvering the bodies afterwards in a really cold, completely detached, very silent manner. And at a certain point, the movie speeds up and we just see him like getting the perfume done, and then a shot of the body discarded. We don't even bother with seeing him do that. So it like escalates in this really strange way that seems very almost detached from the acts of violence themselves.
Yeah, and I think that is a little bit related to the thing that's kind of dropped into the film, and then also in the book it's just dropped in, and then it isn't really drawn out, which is the thing about him not having a smell.
Yes.
Like he doesn't smell of anything. And that's kind of like a realization he has, and you kind of like, well, what's the point of that exactly? But what is that supposed to tell us about this character? Is it that he isn't human? Are we supposed to think that he just kind of isn't, or
that he's lacking something?
Yeah, or he doesn't have this sexual drive, or he doesn't have the kind of normal, weird, dirty human elements. I'm trying to think now if you ever see him like eat.
No. He's just working.
Yeah.
And then
So
ultimately, when he achieves his goal, he then kind of chooses to destroy himself. Because then what else is he going to do?
And also kind of his goal is also really quite odd, right? Because he just wants to make this. He doesn't want to make this perfect perfume for money or to control people or fame. It's like he literally just wants this. And then, the whole narrative is building up to, what happens when he achieves making this perfect perfume. And then obviously they find him and they know he's killed all these people. Huge spoilers, of course, here. And then you see him, he's being taken up to the executioner's platform kind of thing. And then he brings out the perfume and he puts a tiny little bit in the air, and I love this.
Me too.
I actually love it as a scene. Everyone is entranced by this amazing perfume. Must be the strongest perfume in the known universe, because it's like a tiny bit he uses and everybody who's there to watch him die immediately changes their mind. Alan Rickman, who is the dad of the girl that he killed and he was really after, because she was his final ingredient, he comes up to say, "You don't fool me, you won't trick me," and then ends up kind of weeping and holding him and calling him his son. Which I think is
it's amazing. And there's this in that scene, there's this amazing shot where he's like, the director's like following the napkin on which this drop of perfume is, this like CGI napkin, and you see all these extras like a wave coming over them of just ecstasy.
Yeah, and then they have an orgy.
Yeah, and then everyone fucks.
Just incredible.
Everyone in this dirty, putrid 17th century French execution spot just have sex with each other.
It's so good.
And then they all go to sleep. Which is the most believable thing about this film.
And then they wake up the next morning and they're like, "What the fuck? Get off me." Which is, we've all been there. But this was, I love that. I'm a person that thinks there should be more sex in films, so I absolutely loved this. But it did kind of make me think, like, why doesn't he want to be killed? Because he's achieved his one goal. He wasn't achieving it to use it for anything in particular. He hasn't got anything in his life. We haven't really seen him having much of like a survival instinct apart from around this one task. So I'm kind of like, well, narratively, why did he bother not just being killed?
So I have a slight theory that it's very hashed out just as I was listening to you speak. But first of all, I just want to point out another very funny and relatable moment in Perfume is that he gets so annoyed at everyone and overworked that he goes to a cave basically just to rot by himself, to be alone with his thoughts. And I love that scene. He's like, "Fuck everyone, I'm just gonna go lie down in a cave, just be alone with the smells."
Yeah, it's quiet here. I can vibe with that a lot. Just needing the peace and quiet.
But my point is, like, it kind of follows the plot line or the narrative arc of an incel, right? Because he's this super endowed guy. No one can appreciate his talent. No one can see how great he is at smelling. And then he learns off of his own hard work and his back and his ingenuity. He learns how to do this thing, how to make perfumes, preserve smells. Nobody can appreciate his vision. Everybody thinks he's mad. And then he's captures all these girls who wouldn't look at him sideways in the street, and he murders them, and he takes what he wants from them, which is their scent, and then he has this like perfect perfume, and no one wants to fuck him even after he got that done. And then he gets so sad because he's standing there on this executioner's platform looking at everyone else, literally everyone else, including the mayor, the Pope or whoever's there, like the religious figure guy, the executioner. Everyone is having sex with one another. Nobody's having sex with him. And he just leaves. Instead of just going in there into the orgy, he's just like, well, I guess I'll go. And he goes, and he's like, well, I got all of this done. I got the super perfume. I have the best sense of smell in the entire world. I made the perfect perfume, and still nobody wants to fuck me. Well, I guess I'll just die. It's an insult narrative, isn't it?
I like that as a hot take.
It's a very half-assed hot take.
I do like it. I think perhaps where it falls down as a theory is he doesn't. So I had to read a lot about incels in the last few years for my my last book that came out on sex robots, and he doesn't seem to buy into the social structures that incels buy into, right? Like incels feel very aggrieved that they aren't achieving by what they see as these really set systems. You know, they believe there's like Chads and Amy's or whatever they're called. And if you are simply unfortunate enough to not be born with like a particular bone structure or height or, you know, a set of nice teeth or whatever, you simply aren't going to be able to date properly. And what they want is sex, even though they seem to hate women, or they want something from the system. Whereas he kind of doesn't want anything from the system. In fact, when when the orgy is happening and the narrative says he could do anything, he could go to the Pope and be, wave a little bit of his perfume and be like sainted, or he could go to the king and be the leader. But he doesn't want any of that. Like it's kind of like, what does he want as a character?
I don't know, because the film, I think this is where it falls down, right? It's like, what do you want? And the film, the voiceover says this kind of slightly basic woo-woo thing of like, he would never be loved and he couldn't live with that. I was like, okay, can you really not love someone because they don't smell of anything? I mean, sure, it'll take a little bit of getting used to, but I don't know. Yeah. Doesn't seem that deep.
I feel, it needs something, the film, that the book kind of doesn't, or maybe the book does need it actually, like some kind of thing that makes the smell thing work. Like his severing from his mother, he didn't get to be with her skin. He's always felt this loss. He's never, that's kind of hammy, but it would be something. Whereas I feel like it just kind of doesn't have that really. But I do really like the end. So, that isn't the actual end. The end is then that he realizes he's not going to get whatever it is he wants. And then he actually goes back to the fish market where he was born and, covers himself in the perfume and then offers himself up as a kind of physical sacrifice. And the people come, and we don't really actually see it, but they just tear him apart, really, don't they? They just consume him, because they're intoxicated by this perfume, by lust, by, passion, whatever it is. And that's very interesting.
I love that ending.
Yeah.
And there's no detective figure. He gets caught, but then he gets away with it again. But he self-destructs.
Yeah.
It's a very clean, neat ending, and also it's quite a disturbing image to see a man be sort of torn apart by a small mob.
Well, so I think this is a reference to a period of French history, like a really dark thing that happened in French history.
Oh.
So a few years ago, I read a book called Eat Him If You Like. Have you heard of it?
No.
Oh my God, you will really vibe with it, Anna. It's
okay, I'm into
very.
it.
It's very short and it's very dark. And it's basically about this like French village in, I think, the 17th century, where the whole village basically lost their minds. And it was like a real kind of mob mentality thing that happened over something very, very small, and just a misunderstanding, or someone said that this man had said something insulting, and they end up literally eating him alive. And it's really happened. And the Eat Him If You Like title is from a quote of someone in the book where they say, what should we do with this man? And I think it's the chief of police or whatever says, eat him if you like. And they do, and it's like this collective insanity. Yeah, it really, really happened.
Why is this not a movie?
Oh, it's so brutal. The book is so brutal.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so I wondered if it was a reference to that.
I wonder that too now, and I have no idea. Tom Tykwer, if you're listening, let us know.
And also make that movie.
Oh my god, you should write that movie. That's amazing.
You know, I'll step up.
Yeah.
I'll do it.
And as we kind of wrap up our chat about both of these films, you know, there's a reason I put them together, you know, initially because of the way that they took us inside the mind, or in the case of Perfume, the nostrils of a killer. What are the things popped out to you that both of these films, which on the surface have absolutely nothing to do with one another, what do you think kind of stands out that links them together for you?
Well, as I said, the kind of fetishization of dead women obviously is a strong theme between the two. The kind of troubled killer, you know, and the way that we are led to think of them as troubled or lacking something or coming to killing through something that wasn't really their fault or something that happened to them or their circumstances. That feels very, like, it's a really strong link between the two, and it actually quite outside of the serial killer canon, if we can say it like that. Like, we're not always led to think of them as like people who can kind of morally be forgiven, because how could they end up any other way, you know? Which I don't know if I believe that about these characters, but they're very, to me, weirdly, they kind of both sit within the kind of Buffalo Bill serial killer. Do you know what I mean?
What do you mean by
like
that?
This? Well, especially in The Cell, I think the killer in The Cell has much more in common with the killer in Silence of the Lambs in the way he fetishizes the body. And does that make sense?
Yeah, and also in the way that they kind of excuse his killings through childhood abuse, or like they try to rationalize it, and by rationalize it, they excuse it.
Exactly. And you kind of, it's a little bit of a stretch, but you could say we're doing this with Grenouille as well, right? Like, he was literally birthed into a puddle beneath a fish table, and then his mother kind of kicked him down the street.
Yeah, he wasn't loved as a child, so he will never be capable of love. Yes.
I think that's the kind of tie between them. And yeah, that is very kind of classic in a way, but then they're so psychologized, you know, we are meant to feel sorry for them, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And also I think that, you know, both Grenouille and Carl in The Cell are serial killers that are kind of devoid of a conventional inner life. You know, they're like many other serial killers, are really consumed with their fantasy, whatever that might be. And like, to echo what you were saying about the way they fetishize women's bodies, the films kind of do that for them visually, I think. Their victims, aside from one character, the last girl in Perfume, none of them get names. They don't get any information. They're really treated like dolls, like props. And also it's this thing that I was referencing before with kind of the gallery museum aspect in The Cell. You get that in Perfume as well. You know, they want to keep something off of these girls that they kill in their little twisted serial killer memory box. Whether that's the little perfume flasks that Grenouille has, or whether it's this, you know, like dream, like over elaborate dreamscape. But they are always displaying them. They always have them in the little exhibition box.
Mm. Yeah, and the really good imagery from Perfume is when he has the woman in that enormous tank.
Yes.
And, you know, she's just hanging there. That felt very kind of classic,
Yes.
you know, in this kind of genre, in a way that felt very modern.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess also the killers are both killed at the end of both films, right?
That's true.
In the way that in his dream world in the cell. So we didn't really mention it, but J-Lo goes back, kind of locks everyone out of the room and goes back into his dream world. And then there's him as a young boy in his mind, and she drowns him.
Yes.
You know, and we're supposed to understand that it's to stop him from becoming this horrible. Yes, exactly. And then, of course, Grinwy at the end offers himself up and they eat him alive. And that's actually quite unusual, isn't it? That the serial killers are killed not through, like, just being shot by a cop who's been after them, or they're not put in prison, or they don't, you know, they're not killed for some reason related to their crimes. They're killed for a reason related to their trauma.
I'm obsessed also with the fact that The Cell is the one movie where J-Lo kills a child. Definitely.
It was an odd choice for her.
Yes. And even
But
then she rebranded it as something positive.
Yeah. I think her killing that child is the most interesting thing about that character. Isn't it?
It's the outfits. It's the fits.
Yeah.
Heather, before we wrap up, is there anything about either one of these films that you wanted to bring up that we haven't covered?
Yeah, in Perfume, I think Alan Rickman is playing Alan Rickman in
and
this
he
movie.
always plays Alan Rickman beautifully. I will not hear a word against that man.
Yeah. But in the same way that Christopher Walken is playing Christopher Walken at the end of Dune 2, you know, they're doing Christopher Walken does this character. They're not doing the character.
Yeah.
But Alan Rickman does a pretty great you know, he's I could just watch him all day. But his response to finding his dead daughter is one of the oddest pieces of acting he's ever done.
Where he squints.
He sort of squints and then kind of moans, but not really. I'm still thinking about it. I can't make sense of what he was thinking.
There was a lot of choices in this film. A lot of them.
They were, at the very least, they gave us a lot to think about.
They gave us a couple great scenes. They gave us a great orgy.
Yes. And look, so few movies do.
That is true, especially now. Now they just promise you an orgy and they don't deliver an orgy. Looking at you, challengers. Bullshit, I want my money back. Heather, this has been such a treat. Thank you so much. And can you let listeners know where they can find more of your work, buy your books?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to spend some time with you, Anna. I have a website, which is heatherparry.co.uk, or you can find me at Heather Parry Writer on Instagram. And also I'm on Twitter, but I'm trying to not be on Twitter, so I'm not going to give you that.